Today is June 11th, 2025, and this is Read Through the Bible, special recap edition on the book of Mark.
And if you missed it, if your habit is to listen in the afternoon, if you missed it this morning, we read from Mark chapter 15 and 16, finishing out the Gospel of Mark. So if you've not listened to that, I encourage you to go back an episode and listen to that episode. This one, we are going to recap all of the Gospel of Mark that we've been listening to the last 2 weeks or so.
Yeah, we've been doing that with each book when we get to the end, and so we're going to do that with Mark. And this is a densely packed book.
Yeah, it is. In fact, that's one of the key words of Mark is immediately. Mm-hmm. It moves on really quickly. It's the shortest of the four Gospels. Just short and to the point. The shortest in terms of the number of chapters, only 16 chapters. And really, it kind of cuts in half. So 16 chapters. The first 8 chapters is really asking a question. Who is Jesus? Like, who is this one? He appears on the scene. Yeah, he appears on the scene, and then he does all these miracles. What an amazing thing. And there's like questions right in the middle of chapter 8 when Jesus asks the good question, who people say that I am. Then he asks the great question, who do you say that I am? And Peter says, you are the Christ. So, who is Jesus? He's the Christ. He's the Messiah. And then from 8 and following, then actually there's a second half where Jesus is explaining what the Christ is. Who's the Messiah? What is the Messiah like? So, right, who is Jesus? 1 through 8, and then what's the Messiah like? 8 through 16.
And the Messiah is not like what the Jews were expecting.
Yeah, and I think that's the big thing, because as soon as Peter confesses that, the disciples start talking about, well, who's the greatest? Can I sit at your right hand? They're expecting this big kingdom.
Right, and instead, Jesus says in 10:45 that he came not to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. So he came to serve and be a sacrifice and suffer.
Yeah, and that's what we're going to see.
Sacrifice.
He's going to explain that, and then he's going to live that as he suffers in 11 through 16, the Passion Week, when he comes into Jerusalem, and he is questioned, and finally betrayed, and delivered over, arrested, and crucified. Yeah. So, first 8 chapters, who is Jesus? 8 through 16, what is the Messiah like? Just smashing the minds of the disciples and what he's like.
Yeah, and another thing to keep in mind is that it's helpful to know that there are 3 predictions that Jesus gives of his death, and that's in 8:31, 9:31, and 10:33. Yeah, 10:33 and 34.
Yeah, and that's coming out of trying to describe what the Messiah is like.
Right.
He's saying, I'm going to go and suffer. I'm going to be crucified. I'm going to die and rejected. And I'm going to die. I'm going to rise again, though. So he's trying to explain what the Messiah is like with those predictions.
Yeah, it's helpful to know how that fits into that structure.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay, so what we want to do now is just kind of go through each chapter, and as short as we can. We're going to skip a lot of stuff, but try, like in 6, 7, 8 words to describe each of the chapters.
Yeah, we tried to boil it down as concisely as we could.
Yeah, and so there's a lot of, I don't want to say code words here, but a lot of things where if you kind of know the gospel story, you'll be able to fill in a lot of the details here, what's happening. So, for instance, Mark chapter 1, we had 4 words. John baptizes, Jesus begins. So, there's all of the John's ministry. He comes preaching repentance. He's baptizing. He baptizes Jesus. And then Jesus begins his ministry. What's he going to do? He's going to call the first disciples. He's going to do some of the first miracles that he does.
So there's a lot packed in that word begins. Jesus begins.
But if you just think about how does the ministry of Jesus begin, and if you know about the life of Jesus, you can kind of pick that out. Mm-hmm. Okay, and then chapter 2, I think there's a bad chapter break here. 2 should really go all the way through chapter 3, verse 6, where we read in chapter 3, verse 6, that from that point on, the Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him.
Yes. And chapter 2 through 3:6 is a series of events that then trigger questions that the religious leaders and the Herodians start asking Jesus. Mm-hmm. So an event and then a question, an event and then a question.
Yeah, and a lot of these have to do with religious things. And so the way I've summarized it really shortly is that the leaders ask about religious things, which are like fasting and eating with sinners and the Sabbath. How can you do that? Like real religious sort of stuff. And then chapter 3, verse 6, they seek to destroy him. So I think that's like chapter 2. Leaders ask about religious things. 3:6, seek to destroy him.
Yeah.
So like that's, and then that takes you through chapter 3, verse 6, and the rest of chapter 3, just has the 12 disciples appointed. This whole deal with Beelzebul, calling Jesus like Satan, and
that includes the unpardonable sin. But...
yeah, if you know about that,
right.
Blasphemy against the Holy Spirit. But Beelzebul is a nice word to summarize all of that. And then the mother and brothers of Jesus.
Yep. So the condensed summary there is disciples, Beelzebul, mother and brothers.
There you go. Okay, and then chapter 4.
Kingdom parables.
Kingdom parables. Yep. And also he calms the sea in chapter 4. Kingdom parables, calming the sea. Chapter 5, we have basically 3 miracles. So we try to summarize these with Gerasene demoniac, bleeding woman, and dead daughter. So you remember, like, dead daughters raised. This Gerasene demoniac, that's the one where they had all the legion of demons going to the pigs. Yep. Uh-huh. But it's in Gerasene, so it's in Gentile land. So the Gerasene demoniac, bleeding woman, dead daughter. In chapter 6, we have just some events. John beheaded, feeding 5,000, walking on water. Like those are really, that's, I mean, there are other things going on here. Like chapter 6 begins with Jesus getting no honor in Nazareth. You just got to choose when you do these summaries about what's most important. Yeah. And I think those are the most important events there. Okay. Chapter 7.
Okay. 7, we came up with inward defilement, Syrophoenician daughter, and a mute speaks.
Yep, or the mute speaks.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this defilement, inward defilement, of course, that's, remember, right there, they're not washing their hands on the outside. And Jesus says, no, it's not what's on the outside of you comes in. It's what from within that's going to defile you. Chapter 8, we have feeding 5,000.
4,000.
Feeding 4,000, yep. And then what's so significant here is Peter confesses Jesus is the Christ. Or maybe, quote, you are the Christ would be just fine here.
Or so, Peter's confession.
Peter's confession would be good. Yep. And then prediction number 1.
And that's where it turns.
Yep.
Is with Peter's confession.
Yep. And with Peter's confession, now Jesus, who's Jesus? Well, he's the Christ. And so Jesus then turns and says what this Messiah is like. He's like one who's going to suffer and die and raise again. And so those are like some big events here. You might also put the cost. I mean, so that's also like the cost of following Jesus. You must take up your cross and follow me. It's like, it's not going to be all glory. It's going to be death to follow Jesus. He's going to be the dying one. You need to die as well. And then chapter 9, one big event is
Transfiguration.
Yep.
And then a second prediction number 2.
And then the disciple, who's the greatest? And so if you just, who's the greatest, the disciples are asking this question. It shows they don't understand what Jesus is talking about the Messiah. That's why from 8 and following, it's all about what's the Messiah like.
Right.
In chapter 10, we talked about this in our summary, divorced children, RYR, rich young ruler. Prediction number 3, and then the glory request. That's where James and John come and say, oh, can we sit on your right hand and left hand at the kingdom? Like, again,
they don't get it.
Still don't get it. Even as he talks about, no. The Messiah is like this. He's going to suffer and die. And some is they thought that the Messiah was going to come and redeem Israel.
Right.
And that's
in
true.
Glory.
In time.
In triumph.
But that'll be later. First he dies for the sins of his people. Okay, and then chapter 11 starts with the triumphal entry. It's always, I mentioned before how it's key to know what chapter the triumphal entry begins in all the Gospels, and in Mark it begins in chapter 11. So you think about the triumphal entry is going to come in on a colt, so that involves this whole deal about the disciples going and getting a colt from somebody, and he gets in the colt, and then in the triumphal entry there's the fig tree and cleanses the temple. Curse of the fig tree cleanses the temple.
Okay.
Yep. Then chapter 12.
So we have Jesus teaches on various things in response to questions that he's asked. So we summarized it as tenants, taxes, resurrection, and Psalm 110.
Okay. So the tenants, that's the story about the vine growers who came,
Jesus was
rented
telling
out
a parable,
the land. Yeah, it's a parable
against the Pharisees.
About these people who rented out the land, and he sent him the servants. They abused them, and then they killed the son, and that sort of thing from Psalm 118. That's the tenants, the story of the tenants. And then taxes, Jesus was asked about taxes. Resurrection, Jesus was asked about resurrection. So maybe taxes, question mark. Resurrection, question mark.
Yeah, that would probably be good.
And then the greatest commandment, question mark. And then Jesus asks about Psalm 110, question mark. Like those would be good. Like it was all about testing Jesus is what all these were. Or even in the greatest, right, tenets and testing Jesus. About taxes, resurrection, greatest commandment. Jesus then responds, Psalm 110. So just really short, you want to just get it one line, 6, 7, 8 words. Okay, chapter 13, signs of the end. And then really there be alert is really the key there in 13.
The application of it.
Yep. Chapter 14, we have...
Last Supper, Gethsemane, betrayal, and trial.
Yep. And if you know the Last Supper, that has to do with Jesus being anointed and eating everything with them. And then they go out to Gethsemane and pray. And while they're in Gethsemane, that's when he is betrayed by Judas. And he's actually then denied by the disciples. Peter denies him, but then he starts his trial.
Right.
So, Last Supper, Gethsemane, betrayal, trial. I think it's really good. Okay, 15.
Okay, Barabbas is released. Jesus is crucified and buried.
Yep, that's really simple.
Yeah.
Okay, in chapter 16, resurrection.
That's really simple.
Really simple, yep. And there is immediately the Gospel of Mark, really quick like. It's all about who is Jesus. And as soon as, chapter 8, he's revealed that Jesus is the Christ, then the Mark goes on to explain what the Christ is like, what the Messiah is like. That's what Christ means.
That he came to serve and to suffer and to be a sacrifice.
Mm-hmm. Good. And they're just misunderstandings about what that's going to be. That's why his predictions are there. He's going to tell what he's going to do, and then actually does it, beginning with the triumphal entry in chapter 11. So that is our recap edition.
Okay.
And tomorrow we're going to start the book of Deuteronomy.
Right. So we're going back to the Old Testament.
Yep. Another long Old Testament book. But hang with it. We're going to help you through it. Deuteronomy is actually a great book.
Right. And so, yep. And just to be clear, so this morning we did an episode on reading chapters 15 and 16 of Mark.
Yep.
And then this is the recap edition. And then tomorrow we start Deuteronomy.
Yep. Great. And we will see you tomorrow.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.